we're gonna go and talk IFHE changes now. So that's the primary thing now. First things first, of course, do keep in mind that in order to respec your captains, you should probably be going to the main website, finding the patch notes, which on the NA website is down here, update 9.2, the European Destroyers Part 1. Click that, and then there is a button here that says activate free respec. This free respec, to the best of my knowledge, is only going to be lasting about a couple of days. I think it's like, yeah, not too long. So I would recommend you do that immediately so that when you get back in game, if you have to respec any of your captains or whatever, you can do so. So please make sure to go on the website first so you can get these free captain respecs. In fact, you know, if you have any screwed up captains from any other builds or whatever, for all of your ships, you might want to just do it all. Just respec everything and then spec everything all over again for the next couple of days. Alright, so let's talk about IFHE changes. It's a pretty major change. A lot of things have actually been altered. So is it worth it now to have IFHE? And the answer is, I think mostly things haven't changed as much as people think. There are some small changes here and there, but I think the majority of the decision making really impacts only ships at tier 7. For a lot of the other ships, you're probably not going to have to change your captain much. But anyways, let's take a look at what they have actually changed. Alright, so this is the first thing. So the bonus applied to the armor penetrating capabilities of HE shells has now been changed from 30% to 25%. And according to this, if you take a look, it should be universally applied regardless of what tier you are. Now, for a while there, they had this sort of weird tier 7s get the 25%, tier like 8 to 10 get the 30%. Now it's just a universal 25% as well. On top of that, there's now a penalty which it cuts your base fire chance by 50%. In the past, they used to subtract a few percentage points here and there, but now it's just a base percentage reduction. However, that means the skills that boost fire chance, like Demolition Expert and your flags, those are not affected by the IFHE bonuses. Alright, so and I think it actually tells you here, the skill will now reduce the chance of fires by half instead of subtracting 1% or 3% from them, depending on the caliber, right? So it only is the standard chances of fire being caused by HE shells that are now reduced. Okay, so let's see here, and here's the example. Standard chance of fire caused by HE shells for the cruiser Helena was 12%. So with the IFHE skill, this fire chance is now 6%, and if you have Demolition Expert, now it's 8%. Okay. Alright, so the other change that they've made is they've now made it so that if your HE shell penetrates X amount on the port interface, if you look at the HE penetration, it's straight up, that is how much armor you penetrate. So there's no more clunkiness there, there's no weirdness, it's just very, very simple and straightforward. Okay, furthermore, they've also changed some armor. Yeah, they've actually done a whole bunch of changes here, which is, it's a little bit messy right now. So they've also gone ahead and changed the deck and side plating armor for a lot of the cruisers. But of course, I'll get to that in a little bit here. Let's first talk about IFHE and what ships you will likely need it on. Okay, so the current, most of the, I guess, ships that we want to talk about is in this category here. The 150, 152 millimeter ships, the 152, 155s, and then the 180 millimeter ships. And the 180 millimeter ship currently in the game would be things like the Donskoy at the higher tiers. And really that is the sort of the notable ship that we need to talk about because that is the one we have to make a decision. And the answer is if you're playing with a 180 millimeter gun at like tier 9 with the Donskoy, currently, after the change, you can penetrate 30 millimeters of armor straight up. That doesn't allow you to penetrate through the 32 millimeter plating armor of battleships. So if you're playing a Donskoy, you still need to have IFHE. If you're playing with tier 8 to 10 cruisers and you've got 152 or 155 millimeter guns, they can penetrate currently 30 to 31 millimeters of armor respectively. So if you're playing this, these are ships like, for example, the Worcester, Seattle, Cleveland. Again, you want to be taking IFHE. Once again, the same issue applies because if you can't penetrate through the plating, the 32 millimeter plating of battleships at tier 8, 9, 10, your damage reduction is quite severe. So I would recommend strongly that once again, if you're playing with these ships, that you take IFHE. Interestingly enough, if you look at this, 155 millimeter gives you 31 millimeters of penetration. This is for the Mogami. Is actually a very strong buff to her because she should be able to penetrate through a new threshold, that of the USN battleship center deck plating. So that change is actually quite significant for the Mogami. But once again, IFHE is probably recommended. Alright, now if you are down at the lower tier ships, so this is the 152 millimeter ships down at like tier 7, this is the one where I would say there is the most number of things for you to think about. So if you are top tier, which means you're running into other tier 7 battleships, you probably want to take IFHE just so you can penetrate through their armor easily and get those nice penetration HE damage. However, 25 millimeters with the current boost of 25% does not give you sufficient HE penetration to go through the higher tier battleships. And there, the penalty that you're going to suffer for not having fire chance is going to be a little bit on the painful side. So this is definitely something that as a player, you're going to have to think about. You're really going to have to think about, do I care more about fire chance if I'm, bottom tier and I'm running into higher tier things? Or do I just want to, in the matches where I do get top tier, have the ability to really go and wreck people? That's kind of an interesting little concept or whatever notion to be thinking about there. It's, the fire chance penalty is quite severe, and you're going to see a significant reduction in the number of fires you're going to get in the game. So if you're playing with sort of tier 7 cruisers with 152s, you're really going to have to think about it. That's the best way to put it for you. All right. However, if you have German ships with the 150 millimeter guns, so this is like Nuremberg or whatever, no, then you don't really have to care because you still have sufficient penetration to go through everything. The German ships always have maintained sort of that excellence in terms of their HE penetration, and the numbers stay as of right now. If you're talking about destroyers, destroyers, the only notable destroyer change I would say would be like high tier UK destroyers, where in the past they needed IFHE in order to penetrate the same tier destroyers. That is no longer the case. 113 millimeter guns go through 19 millimeters of armor now, so they can penetrate the plating of same tier destroyers. So if you're playing as a daring, you do not need IFHE anymore. If you're playing the Japanese gunboats with the 100 millimeter guns, this is currently 30 millimeters of penetration. You can go through the cruisers, but again, you can't go through battleships. So even for the Japanese gunboats, I would recommend taking IFHE in order to penetrate those said battleships. Okay, now before I continue on with anything else, people are going to ask, what about ships with bigger guns? Okay, so what if you're dealing with like Henrys or whatever? Well, generally speaking, the rule of thumb is 203 millimeter HE, which already goes through 32 millimeter thresholds. You don't need IFHE, generally. However, if there are specific thresholds you want to cross, then you can decide if you need it or not. And this is a decision you're going to have to make based on looking in-game at the various penetration thresholds that you're going to have with your high explosive. So for example, the Hindenburg right now, if I equip IFHE, I can go through 63 millimeters of armor with my HE. Why would I ever take IFHE on a Hindenburg? It primarily has to do with the fact if I want to deal with something like a Kremlin with its ridiculously thick center deck section, then I would probably be needing something like a Hindenburg. So that mostly happens to deal with like specific ships that you want to deal with, right? So let's take a look at the Kremlin, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So Kremlin, for example, has this chunk in the middle here, that's 60 millimeter center deck. Without IFHE, I have no way of getting through this. So I'm willing, let's say, as a Hindenburg player, in certain scenarios to give up my ability to set more fires for the chance to straight go through the deck. This typically is only going to apply if you're dealing with competitive type modes where you're frequently running into the same kind of ships. So let's say way back in the day, okay, currently it doesn't really apply because nobody really uses Henry IV anymore, but Henry IV, for example, if you throw IFHE on, you're going to be able to go through 50 millimeters of armor. So see it? I still have the skill equipped. Now, of course, that comes at a cost. My fire chance is quite a bit lower than before at only 15%. This is with flags and everything else. But 50 millimeter threshold, if I can, let's say, run into certain scenarios where I might need that, it's still useful, because if you have certain ships like, for example, Moscow with their 50 millimeter deck, or let's say Stalingrad with their 50 millimeter deck, then that could still be useful. But again, it is very selective times of using those skills. The general consensus is if you're 203, you're not going to need IFHE. It's just very select scenarios where you would probably need something like that. Okay, so let's take a look if there's anything else of note. It says, okay, this is talking about the 100 millimeter shells. Okay, apart from that, it says the armor penetration of the 105 millimeter HE secondary battery shells fired by the York, Prince Eitel Friedrich, Scharnhorst B, Gneisenau, Admiral Graf Spee, etc. have now been increased from 18 to 26 millimeters. And it says earlier we've already increased the armor penetration of the 105 millimeter secondary battery shells fired by the Koenig, Bayern, Bismarck, Tirpitz, etc. and the Hindenburg to 26 millimeters. Okay, so this is again something I think you'd have to take a look at because I'm not sure if that crosses any thresholds. Let me just pull up a calculator real quick because I would actually need it to do a little bit of math here. Oh, come on, calculator, help me out. Oh, I open up two. All right, so here we're talking about 26 millimeters and it's 1.25. So this is where you have an interesting number on German battleships with their secondaries. They can penetrate 32.5 with their 26 millimeters of secondary penetration. This means that if you want to run a secondary build German battleship, there is some argument to be made to run that said type of build, because then your HE from your smaller guns are going to be able to penetrate through armor. It's a more debatable type of thing. Generally speaking, again, overall, secondary builds aren't super viable, so taking an IFHE skill purely for that, not particularly convinced about that, right? Okay, other things to talk about here is the armor protection changes. Okay, so there is a couple of significant armor changes that exist now for certain cruisers. And this is actually quite an interesting series of changes, okay? And it doesn't really, like if you look at the sort of the lower tier stuff, it mostly affects things like the light cruisers and things like that. The lower tier, your cruisers are still as pretty much fragile maybe as ever, with a little bit of durability increase on the heavy cruisers. So for example, if you're talking about, and this is, we're gonna have to go down to tier 7 for a second here, so let me go and pull up a tier 7 ship. So if you're talking about a tier 7 cruiser, and we're talking about something like the, oh nuts, I don't have that ship anymore. Oh, that's not good. I thought I had the ship, but apparently I don't. All right, we'll use the tech tree then as a way to find it. If you're dealing with something like, for example, an American heavy cruiser like the New Orleans, for example, you've got a little bit more protection here now. See it? This piece of plating is now 25 millimeters, so that's going to provide you protection against 356 millimeter armor piercing if you are angling. So you can now try to bait shots off of this upper belt, assuming that again you are able to auto bounce shells of that caliber and don't get overmatched. Now if you're looking at the higher tier things, so this is, take a look at this, this is very interesting. This part is actually really interesting. So cruisers carrying guns of a caliber exceeding 190 millimeters, so again this is the heavy cruiser type ships, and the Mogami. The central part of your ship now has 27 millimeters of armor. So in the past, one of the major strong points of American heavy cruisers, especially, was the fact that they had 27 millimeters armor in sort of everywhere. So if you take a look at something like the Buffalo, Buffalo had 27 millimeters bow, 27 millimeter upper belt here, 27 millimeters here, which means that if you angled against 380 millimeter guns aggressively, they would be bouncing their shells off of your armor. Now this same characteristic is on other ships as well. So Saint Louis, which did not used to have an upper belt of 27, now has access to that, as well as an upper deck of 27. So 380 millimeter battleships, if they're shooting at your ship now, if you angle and you try to bait them into shooting into the side, their shells are going to be auto bouncing if you angle correctly. So this gives the heavy cruisers some additional durability as well. Even for the light cruisers, and this says the cruisers carrying the 149 to 190 millimeter guns, so these are the light cruisers, even though they don't get the upper belt, that's 27, their main deck now is 27, and that's up from 25. So again, against certain battleships that carry 380 millimeter guns, these cruisers are going to be more durable. So this is in some ways kind of a nerf you can think of as to, to 380 millimeter armed battleships, such as Bismarck or Richelieu or whatnot, because these cruisers are going to be that much more durable. So think about that. Now, there has actually been both kind of a nerf, maybe even in some cases, some weird cases, maybe even a weird buff at the same time. It's hard to say with these ships. The Colbert, for example, has had its armor actually made thinner, because it used to have a central deck armor that's 30 millimeters. Same with the Smolensk. Now it's thinner. So thinner armor in this game is a little weird. It provides some additional... it provides some chances originally of bouncing shells off the main deck area, but now you might just be getting, overpens. So whether or not this change is a good one is still up for some, I guess, gameplay testing, for example. But as of the moment, it's a bit of an interesting change there as well. Other than that, one final things that we talked about. Oh yeah, there was a bunch of other small armor plating changes that you have to pay attention to. So for example, things like the Graf Spee, they've had their fore and aft end plating reduced from like 19 to 16. So be careful of things like that. And then finally, one last change to pay attention to is the Salem and the Des Moines. So these two American heavy cruisers, like I said, they used to have that unique perk about them. They have had some changes happen to them, which is different than the other ships, which is, take a look at a Des Moines here, and you'll see that a Des Moines now has this. So its 30 millimeter center deck is now extending over to the side as well. Okay, so now this side over here has this additional auto bounce surface against ships like the Montana, basically anything with 406 millimeter guns, up to I think about maximum 420 millimeter guns in the game, because it provides protection up to 429. Okay, and so these are the major armor changes to talk about as well. But again, the most significant one I think for most players is actually going to be the IFHE change, and whether or not you want to spec away from it or not. Most times I think the answer is going to be most things can kind of be left the way it is. I think the only two ships that have been sort of murdered from what they originally were capable of would be Flint and Atlanta, with their 127 millimeter destroyer caliber guns just not really having enough penetration at all to deal with really anything except for stuff at their own tier. And even then, that might be questionable. Actually, I have to double check that 1 second. I don't want to say something that is not actually true. Just let me double check this one quick thing here. Yeah, 26. So the Atlanta can deal with, stuff when it is top tier, but again, it's completely lost its ability to really deal with things that are a little bit more slightly touch bit more armored. So yeah, Atlanta and Flint I think are the two ones that have suffered the most, notably because now their fire chance is also 3.5%. So that big hit to the fire chance makes it so that, in order for you to penetrate when you're top tier, if you just get up tiered or whatever, you're pretty screwed if you're playing Atlanta or Flint. So that is pretty much all the changes to IFHE and Armour that are notable. So yeah, if you've got any questions or comments, time to provide them right now.